By the time the first coach horn split the dawn, Margaret Anderson had already crossed half the yard, with blood warming the heel of her left shoe. The stones were slick with last night's rain and horse foam. Mud sucked at her thin soles. Her fingers had gone white around the iron handles of the account chest, then red again when feeling returned, then white once more as the wind came through the archway and knifed through her shawl. The chest knocked against her knees at every step. It was small enough to look manageable from a distance, small enough to invite contempt from men who had never carried one, and heavy enough to drag her shoulder lower on the right side. A driver watched her lurch, spat into the puddles, and turned away when she looked up. She did not slow. If she set the chest down in this cold, she would not lift it again without help, and help was never free. A footman in Anderson livery stood beneath the inn sign with a leather valise tucked dry beneath his cloak. He had ridden inside the cart while she walked behind to keep the chest steady. Now he announced her purpose, as if reading the weather. "Make way! Lady Anderson's stepdaughter is sent to ask indulgence from men she has inconvenienced. She is only the plain one." He said it loudly enough for the ostlers and coachmen and 2 women buying rolls from the baker's boy to hear. He said it with practised boredom, as if repeating household inventory. The plain one, a broken chair, a cracked basin, a girl with no claim. A low laugh moved through the yard and died when Margaret turned her face toward it. People called her severe when they did not know where to place her. Dark hair pinned badly with a snapped comb, skin too pale from indoor labour, eyes too direct for a dependent. Men preferred soft women, Lady Anderson said often, women who smiled before they were spoken to and never remembered figures. Margaret remembered everything. That was her one luxury. That and silence. Her stomach cramped so hard she had to stop beside a trough and brace the chest against her shin. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, unless one counted the swallow of scorched tea left in the kitchen pot after the maids took their cups. Hunger had a schedule. First the hollow ache, then the trembling, then a sharp, clean edge that almost felt like strength until her vision went thin at the corners. She breathed through her nose and counted fence posts along the far wall, as her father had taught her when pain threatened to shake the numbers loose. The strap of the chest had rubbed a strip raw across her palm. Laundry lye had taken the skin from her wrists 2 days earlier, and ink had settled in the cracks, black as soot, so that even clean water left her looking stained. Lady Anderson had sent her to the yard in a gown that had been mended twice at the hem and once under the arm, and a shawl too light for late autumn, then remarked in front of the breakfast room that Margaret's appearance might stir sympathy where manners could not. The sisters had smiled into their buttered bread, silk at their throats, rings that had belonged to Margaret's mother. No one had asked whether she had eaten before walking 3 miles in rain with ledgers that could drown a house. The lock on the chest was old brass, scored near the keyhole where someone had forced it once and failed. She touched it now, not from fear of theft but from habit, checking by feel what she could not afford to lose. Tenant rolls, rent tallies, grain estimates, boundary sketches on folded rag paper, receipts copied in her hand because Lady Anderson preferred plausible neatness to original ink. Her father had taught her letters at the survey table while men in wet boots waited for decisions. He had laid a calloused finger under columns and said, "Never trust a sum that flatters the owner. Land does not flatter, water does not flatter, debt least of all." She had been 12 and proud to understand. He had been laughing that day. Fever took him 6 winters later, and laughter with him. A coach swung in hard from the London road, wheels spraying the curb, and the horses screamed against the bit. Passengers leaned from the windows, collars high, eyes bright with inconvenience. They looked at Margaret's dress, at the chest, at the footman standing dry beneath his cloak while she bore the load, and they made the same calculation strangers always made. Servant, poor relation, not worth the trouble of pity. The gate porter shouted for room. A trunk fell. Someone cursed the mud on his stockings. The yard swallowed her again. She moved toward the inn office one careful step at a time, the chest grinding against bone. Inside, warmth shone through warped glass in amber squares. She could smell yeast bread, wet wool steaming by the fire, and bacon fat from a pan she would not taste. Each smell arrived like an accusation. Her mouth filled with water, and then with bitterness. She kept walking. At the threshold, the footman shifted into her path without touching her, a courtesy more humiliating than a shove. "Wait," he said. "Lady Anderson did not instruct you to speak unless asked." Margaret's fingers tightened on the handle until pain lanced up her forearm. "I am carrying the accounts. I must deliver them." "You must stand where you're told." The words landed as they always did, flat and familiar. Lady Anderson's house ran on those words. Stand there, do this, hold your tongue. Smile less, write faster, eat later, sleep when the lamps are out. Margaret had obeyed because obedience cost less than open defiance when one had nowhere to go and no dowry left to negotiate with. But there were limits even to drilled compliance, and numbers were one of them. Numbers punished delay. Interest did not wait for permission. She stepped past him before he finished his breath. The chest clipped his polished boot. He hissed and grabbed at her sleeve, then released it when the innkeeper looked up. The inn office was close and overheated, walls lined with pigeonholes and unpaid notices. 2 clerks sat at a narrow desk. One wrote quickly, sanded a page, and reached for the next without glancing up. The other looked at Margaret once, then at the mud on her hem, then at the footman behind her, and decided where authority lived. "Name," he said to the footman, not to her. "On behalf of Lady Anderson," the man replied, "a request for extension on obligations due this week." Margaret set the chest down at last. Her shoulders burned as if the sockets had slipped. For a moment she thought her knees would fold. She pressed her thumb into the ridge of the desk and forced herself upright. The clerk held out his hand for the key. She reached into her reticule and found only lint, a broken pencil nub, and a folded scrap of calculations from midnight. No key. She checked again. Slower, still none. Lady Anderson had kept it. A flush rose beneath her skin, not from shame, but from the speed of the trap becoming visible. Sent with the chest, but not the key. Sent to ask for time without proof to offer. Sent to stand in public and fail where men could witness it. The footman made a small sound in his throat that might have been surprise if she had not heard the same note in the breakfast room, when a glass slipped from her hand and shattered at her feet. "The key appears to be at the house," she said, each word deliberate. "I can read from memory the relevant sums and maturities, and I can copy the tenant obligations in full if you provide paper." The first clerk finally looked up. He was older, with a pen callus deep on his middle finger, and tired eyes that had measured lies for 30 years. "From memory? Yes." The footman gave a short laugh. "She copies figures. She does not understand them." Margaret turned her head toward him. Her hunger sharpened her voice into something precise. "I understand enough to know the wheat rents were counted twice in August to conceal a shortfall in river maintenance. I understand enough to know 3 notes were refinanced at predatory rates against land whose embankment repairs were never completed. If you prefer ignorance, ask him for the key and wait while water takes the lower fields." Silence settled so quickly she could hear the fire snap in the common room beyond. The older clerk watched her face, then her hands, then the hem of her sleeve where the cuff had thinned to threads. He slid a ledger across the desk and set out fresh paper. "Begin," he said. She began. Parcel names first, then acreage, then rent roll by quarter day, then arrears by tenant. She wrote standing because her legs would not trust a chair yet. Ink stained her fingers deeper. Figures came clean and unbroken, each sum carrying the shape of the land behind it. Marsh ground that looked fertile until November drowned it. High strips along the east rise that held barley through bad years. Tenant names she had known since childhood, now reduced in Lady Anderson's books to liabilities and leverage. As she wrote, the yawning pressure in her belly receded to a distant throb. Work did that. Numbers gave pain a boundary. Outside, the yard grew louder with the morning trade. Drovers shouted, hooves rang. Rain started again, fine as wire against the windows. By full light, Margaret had filled 6 sheets and corrected 2 errors in the posted abstracts that had been copied from older, cleaner lies. The older clerk read in silence, lips moving with each column. When he reached the final page, he laid his palm over it as if to keep it from lifting away. "These are not requests for indulgence," he said quietly. "These are warnings." Margaret capped the ink. Her hand shook once, then stilled. "Yes." The footman shifted, impatience returning now that the room had stopped looking at him. "If this is complete, we return at once. Lady Anderson expects me." The clerk ignored him. He addressed Margaret directly for the first time that morning. "Miss Anderson, if what you have written is accurate, Blackthornne is exposed." The name struck like cold water at the back of her neck. Blackthornne Estate. The ducal lands tied to half these notes and nearly all these repairs, grand enough to command 3 counties, and careless enough to trust the wrong signatures. She saw, as if already spread across a map table, the east embankment line, the old weir, the copied error no one had admitted for 3 years. She saw Winter Rain finding that mistake. She also saw Lady Anderson's smile when she learned the key had not been required after all. Margaret gathered the damp pages before the footman could touch them and held them against the locked chest. "Seal copies for your records," she said to the clerk, "and date them today, in full, with witnesses." He gave a single grave nod. Behind her the yard doors banged open on another burst of wind, and the morning came in wet, cold, and urgent. The older clerk took the pages from her one by one, his fingertips careful at the edges where rain had blurred the corners, and called for sealing wax in a voice that carried farther than he intended. The second clerk fetched the brass stamp, a chipped saucer of hot resin, and 2 witnesses from the common room who entered with the look of men invited into business, above their station and reluctant to refuse. Margaret stood where she was, wet hem cooling around her ankles, while the footman shifted beside the door and watched the process with narrowed eyes. Each sheet was dated in full. Each line was read aloud, then repeated back. The routine should have comforted her. Procedure was a fence against denial. Yet, as the clerk's pen scratched the date, her mind kept returning to the empty space in her reticule where the key should have been, and to the breakfast table where Lady Anderson had buttered toast with unhurried elegance, while announcing that Margaret would be sufficient for the errand. Sufficient, never trusted, never named in rooms that counted, unless blame required a mouth to attach itself to. When the wax was ready, the clerk pressed his seal and asked, without looking up, "How long have you managed these accounts, Miss Anderson?" The question struck harder than accusation because it granted competence where her household granted none. 7 years in practice, she said, longer in instruction. He nodded for more, and she gave it because the figures on the page would be challenged the moment they left this desk, and she needed the truth fixed in several minds, not only in hers. Her father, Eric Anderson, had served as surveyor first and steward by necessity whenever the estate purse thinned. He had taught her boundaries before embroidery. She had learned to pace acreage in mud, to mark the difference between standing water and running seep, to count tenant strips by ridgeline rather than rumour. He had also taught her, with a severity gentler than any kindness she had known since, that arithmetic in a great house was never only arithmetic. "A wrong sum in London becomes an empty granary in February," he used to say, pushing a slate toward her after supper while her mother mended cuffs by the hearth. Her mother had coughed that winter and the next. By the spring Margaret turned 13, the cough did not stop. Grief arrived quietly in their lane. It remained loud thereafter. The footman made a displeased sound as if private history were an imposition on his timetable, but the clerk motioned him silent. Margaret went on, voice level, while memory moved through her like weather she had learned to walk in. After her mother's burial, the house did not fail at once. There had been 6 months of careful order. Her father rose before dawn, checked culverts himself, and returned with frost in his beard and mud to the knee. He counted every shilling. He sold 2 cart horses before he sold books. When fever took him in late October, it took judgment with him in the final week, and signatures were gathered while he drifted between sense and delirium. Lady Anderson entered their life first as a practical answer to mourning, then as a permanent authority with silk gowns, and 2 daughters old enough to understand advantage, and young enough to call it natural law. Papers were altered within a fortnight. Rooms were reassigned within a month. By Christmas, Margaret's mother's portrait was moved to the back corridor where lamp smoke darkened the varnish, and the front drawing-room smelled of lavender water and visiting cards from people who had never set foot there while her parents lived. The clerk's pen paused when she said that. He looked up then fully, and his tired eyes sharpened into attention. "I was told to be grateful," she said. "I was given the attic room because it had less draught than the garret. I was told my plainness made me suited to work. I was told my father had left obligations no prudent lady could carry without strict economy." The words came in the same cadence Lady Anderson used when reciting household doctrine, only stripped now of lace and honey. Economy meant Margaret's boots were resoled with stiff scraps that cut her heels raw on long walks. Economy meant her meat portion vanished first when guests were expected. Economy meant the piano was closed to her and opened for the sisters, Amelia and Jane, who practised in warm gloves while Margaret copied rents at the side table and turned pages when summoned. It also meant, very quickly, that anything with clear value left her possession and entered theirs under the language of family necessity. Her mother's garnet pendant was sold for urgent repairs that never occurred. Her dowry bracelet was broken and reset into 2 matching pieces for the sisters' coming-out gowns. Her father's silver field compass disappeared from his desk and reappeared in the drawing-room cabinet with no mention of whose initials were engraved inside. She did not fight for the jewellery. Jewellery did not stop a bank notice. She fought for ledgers, maps and notebooks because those were tools and proof both. Even then Lady Anderson had tried to keep her from them. "A young woman with too much ink forgets her manners," she had said at supper one wet March evening while rain rattled the shutters and Amelia laughed behind her napkin. "You will copy what I place before you, nothing else." Margaret had lowered her head and answered, "Yes, Lady Anderson," because open refusal would have put the books into hands that could not read beyond a total and did not care to. 3 days after that order, she found the first copied weir map in the steward's bundle, and the river line was mirrored, not badly drawn, deliberately mirrored. East marked west. Depth marks shifted by 2 feet where embankment stress would matter most in flood season. She corrected it in pencil and brought it to Lady Anderson at once. Her stepmother had read the margin note, then smiled as if indulging childish fuss. "You are earnest," she said. "It is almost touching. Leave engineering to men and keep your script neat." The corrected copy was never sent. The mirrored one was filed and used. Over the next 2 years, the pattern hardened. Loans were refinanced against projected yields from lower fields already taking water in late rains. Repair disbursements were entered at full amount, then paid out in part through contractors linked by cousinage and courtesy to Lady Anderson's circle. Receipts for stone and timber appeared with identical pen pressure across separate dates, as if written in one sitting. Margaret marked each inconsistency in private shorthand on scraps she hid behind lining cloth in her workbox. She kept parallel tallies in a school notebook stitched with blue thread, the kind no one inspected because it looked beneath notice. By the 2nd week of November, she had learned to carry 2 truths at once: the official account that preserved Lady Anderson's standing, and the factual one that tracked where money and risk were truly going. The clerk asked, very softly, "Why did you remain?" It was not a sentimental question. It was an accountant's question, the kind that sought the mechanism behind endurance. Margaret stared at the seal cooling on the paper and gave the answer she used least because it exposed too much and proved too little. "Because the tenants could not leave," she said. "Because the lower village had no second granary. Because if I walked away, the books would be clean lies by quarter's end, and no one in authority would know until collection failed." She could have added that she had nowhere respectable to go with no dowry and no patron. She could have said that women trained in sums were useful in private and unwelcome in public. She could have said that humiliation was cheap compared with dispossession, and she had measured that cost every day. Instead, she said, because someone had to keep the real numbers alive. The older clerk held her gaze for a long moment, then touched the stack as if acknowledging a fellow tradesman in a market of strangers. The footman stepped forward at last, impatience now sharpened into threat. "This recital serves no purpose. Lady Anderson requires return at once. Hand over the sealed copies." Margaret moved the pages out of his reach without flourish. "They are not yours." The room tightened. Even the witnesses stopped shifting their weight. The footman lowered his voice. "Do not forget what you are." She met his eyes and answered with the calm that made people call her severe. "I am the person who can identify which notes will default first and why. I am the person who can trace your lady's signatures against prior specimens. I am the person who will sign receipt for these copies with date and hour, so none may claim they were altered in transit. If you wish to report insolence, report precision with it." He stared at her, face flushing above his cravat, then looked away first because there were too many listeners and too little script for this exchange in his rehearsed hierarchy. The innkeeper himself appeared with a wooden tray holding stale bread ends and a heel of cheese. He set it near her elbow without comment, eyes on the desk. Charity could humiliate as readily as command, yet this was not charity offered for display. This was practical fuel set down where work was being done. Margaret hesitated only a second before taking a small piece. Salt struck her tongue and steadied her knees. She ate standing quickly while the clerk drafted duplicate notices to the district office and the magistrate's registry. He did not ask permission from Lady Anderson's household before doing so. He did not announce defiance. He simply performed his duty in full sequence, each step a rebuke to private power, dressed as household management. Outside, rain thickened against the panes. Cartwheels hissed through muck. Somewhere in the yard a horse kicked wood and was calmed by a groom's low, patient murmur. When the final seal cooled, the older clerk sanded his signature and pushed 3 packets toward Margaret. 1 for Blackthorne's steward, 1 for the magistrate's clerk, 1 for local record. "You will carry these on your person," he said, "not in the chest." She tucked them inside her bodice lining, where damp could be managed and thieves would hesitate. He then turned to the footman. "You will sign witness to receipt." The man bristled. "I do not take orders from lawfully appointed office," the clerk finished, not raising his tone. "You do today." Reluctantly, with ink blotting where his hand pressed too hard, the footman signed. Margaret watched the name dry and felt the smallest shift in the morning's balance. Not safety, not victory, only record. In houses like hers, record was the closest thing to mercy the system offered. She bent, lifted the account chest again, and felt fresh blood slick at her heel where the stiff seam had reopened. Pain flared bright and immediate. She welcomed its clarity. It left no room for panic. At the threshold she paused and looked back once at the desk where her father's discipline had just been given public shape. The clerk had already turned to the next petitioner, head bowed, pen moving. Work resumed. That, too, steadied her. Systems endured because ordinary men did their tasks even when powerful families preferred silence. The yard doors groaned wide under a gust, and cold rain struck her face like thrown beads. The footman reached for the chest as if to reclaim appearances before they reached the street. She shifted away. "You may carry your valise," she said. "I will carry what I can prove." Then she stepped out into the wet morning, sealed papers warm against her ribs, the locked brass biting her palm, and every mile back to Anderson House laid before her like a ledger line she intended to survive. Rain struck Margaret's face the moment she crossed the threshold, thin and hard as thrown gravel, and the yard that had seemed merely crowded an hour ago had become a churn of wheels, shouting men, steaming horses and slipping boots. She shifted the chest higher against her hip, searching for a line through the traffic toward the south gate, when a rider came through the arch at reckless speed and swayed in the saddle as if the wind had cut his spine. His horse stumbled, recovered, and stopped short near the water trough. The rider slid half out of the seat, caught himself once on the pommel, then fell. He hit the stones beside Margaret's skirts with a sound that turned heads and stopped speech for one hard breath. The footman cursed and stepped back to protect his own coat. Margaret had already set down the chest. She knelt in mud without feeling it soak through her hem, and turned the man enough to clear his airway. He was young, no more than 30, face grey with cold, cravat dark with rain, and a narrow stripe of blood where stone had split the skin under his jaw. Not a mortal wound, a dangerous one only if left untended in this weather. His gloved hand was locked around a leather dispatch tube strapped under his greatcoat. Blackthorne's crest was pressed into the flap, half obscured by mud. "Water!" she said sharply to no one and everyone, "and send for the inn surgeon." The innkeeper moved first. A stable boy ran second. Men who had watched her carry ledgers now watched her brace a stranger's shoulders and keep his head from striking stone each time he shook. The courier's lashes fluttered. His lips moved without sound. Margaret bent close. "Blackthorne," he rasped at last, "to his grace. East Bank, cracked in the night." He coughed, breath tearing in his chest. "Hours, not days." The footman seized her elbow. "Leave him. We return now." She pulled free without looking at him. If that dispatch waits, your lady may lose more than a morning. The courier's fingers would not unclench from the tube. Margaret eased one glove off, worked at each knuckle, and felt the tremor running through him. He was burning with fever under the rain chill. A groom knelt opposite her with a bucket. She wet her handkerchief and pressed it under the man's jaw to slow the bleeding. The cut was shallow. The collapse had done more damage than the fall. "Can you stand?" she asked, his eyes open to slits. "No." "Then you do not move." She looked up at the nearest ostler. "Bring a door plank or a cartboard. Keep him flat." The ostler blinked once, then obeyed. Her own left heel throbbed inside her shoe where the seam had reopened. Blood and rain made a warm, cold slick along her stocking. She ignored it. The dispatch tube mattered now. If the embankment had split overnight, the lower fields would already be taking water. If the river steward had judged the breach line wrong, the force would turn toward the tenant village and granary by dawn tomorrow. She saw it as clearly as if she stood on Blackthornne's east rise. Pressure at the bend, old Phil giving way, then the channel biting where men had trusted ornamental walls to behave like floodworks. The courier caught at her sleeve with surprising strength. "No detour! To him only!" His eyes rolled toward the archway as if willing a figure to appear. "Do not let his family choose the roses." Her stomach tightened. Even half senseless, the man understood the choice that would come. By then the yard had begun to move again around them in jagged currents. A coachman shouted for passage. A mare kicked at her traces. The rain thickened, blurring the far gate and turning cloaks to slick black plains. Margaret glanced once toward the road, calculating distance and delay, and reached for the dispatch tube. The footman saw and hissed, scandalised. "You will not touch ducal correspondence." "Then fetch the Duke this instant," she said, "or stand aside." He did neither. He hovered useless and indignant, while she wiped mud from the clasp and felt beneath it for damage. The seal held. Good wax. Fresh impression. It had left Blackthornne within hours. She could not break it while the recipient was absent unless she accepted whatever followed. She weighed that against water rising through seed grain and winter stores. The balance lasted one heartbeat. Boots pounded under the arch before she made the choice. 3 riders entered in a spray of mud, the centre horse black and lathered, the rider bareheaded despite rain, coat unbuttoned at the throat as if speed had mattered more than propriety. He dismounted before the groom reached him. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair plastered to his brow, jaw cut hard enough to look carved, mouth set in a line that did not waste words on warning. Men moved when he moved, not because he raised his voice, because he did not need to. "Clear the yard," he said, and the command cracked through rain and hoof noise alike. "You two, carry that man inside, carefully. Do not bend his neck." The ostlers obeyed at once. The footman from Anderson House bowed too late, almost tripping over the chest Margaret had left in the mud. He began, "Your Grace, this is—" The Duke's attention had already shifted to the courier, then to the dispatch tube in Margaret's hand, then to Margaret herself, soaked shawl clinging to her shoulders, ink-blackened fingers, hair coming loose at the temples, face pale with cold and hunger, one shoe darkened at the heel. His gaze was not polite. It was inventory. "Give me that," he said. She did not move quickly enough for his liking. His hand closed over the tube, then stopped when he saw the intact seal and the mud crusted over the crest. He looked at the courier being lifted onto the plank. "How long down?" "Less than 5 minutes," Margaret answered. "I did not ask you." No one else was counting. For the first time his eyes met hers fully, storm grey and flat with authority. The rain ran from his hair to his collar and disappeared into black wool. "Name?" "Margaret Anderson." Recognition did not show in his face. It showed in the footman's eagerness to supply rank where contempt might please power. "Lady Anderson's stepdaughter, Your Grace. She has exceeded her place repeatedly this morning." Margaret felt heat rise despite the cold. She kept her gaze on the Duke. "Your courier says the east embankment cracked in the night. He says ours." The Duke broke the seal with his thumb and scanned the page once. Whatever he read altered his breathing by a degree and no more. "Saddle relay mounts," he said to one of his men. "Now!" He folded the letter, turned to stride toward the archway, then checked when Margaret spoke again. "The measurement is wrong." He looked back, slowly. Rain ticked off the brim of the nearest groom's hat into the silence between them. "My steward measured it himself," he said. "Then he measured against the mirrored weir copy." Her voice steadied as numbers replaced pain. "Depth marks on the East Channel were reversed 3 years ago when the map was recopied. 2 feet lost on paper. 2 feet gained in flood force at breach." The rider nearest him muttered, "Presumption!" The Duke did not rebuke the man. He did not rebuke her either. "You read that from one page in rain." "I carried the tide notes this morning. I know which repairs were paid and which were entered as if paid. Your East Embankment patch was listed at full stone weight in August. Half the loads were never delivered." The footman made a small choking sound. "Your Grace, she is overtired. She speaks beyond reason." Margaret did not glance at him. "Ask me for the gauge points." The Duke took one step toward her. Close now, he smelled of wet wool, horse and cold iron. "If you are wrong, I will have no use for you. If I am right, your lower gardens must be sacrificed before dawn, or the river will take your tenant village, granary and winter seed." The words landed in the yard like a dropped weight. Even the coach horses seemed to quiet. He held her gaze for 3 breaths, then, clipped and precise, "Gauge points." First marker below the old willow cut, nominal 4 feet in dry October, now likely 6 and rising. Second marker at the stone saint by the east path reads shallow by 2 because the copied contour is reversed. If your men cut at the ornamental terraces by the south wall, pressure will vent toward the gardens and spare the village. If they cut at the inner gate, you drown your own stores. A younger groom stared at her, as if she had blasphemed. No one spoke to ducal landscaping, as if it were arithmetic to be traded for grain. Margaret felt the old training in her spine. Stand straight, keep the sum clean, let rank spend its anger where it likes. The Duke unfolded the letter again and compared 2 lines. His thumb paused at a figure. He looked back at her hands, at the split skin across her palm, at the smear of blood where rain had washed through the cuff. Then his eyes dropped to her left shoe and the dark streak trailing from it on wet stone. "Why are you bleeding?" he asked. The question was so direct it almost disoriented her. Men of his station asked what one had done wrong, never what one had endured doing it. She answered with the only truth that would not waste time. "Bad stitching and distance." His mouth tightened. Not quite contempt, not quite anything she could name. One of his riders returned to run. "Mounts ready, Your Grace." The Duke thrust the opened letter at him. "Ride ahead to Blackthornne. Tell Stuart to hold the east line and prepare controlled breach at South Terraces only on my signal. No one touches the inner gate. Repeat it." The rider repeated, stumbled over one term, corrected himself, and flew back to the horses. The Duke turned to Margaret again. "You will come." The footman sputtered, outraged. "Your Grace, Lady Anderson expects her return. The accounts—" Silence. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The footman fell quiet, colour draining from his face. Margaret looked at the chest sunk half in mud, at the strap that had torn her palm open, at the sealed packets warm against her ribs, at the courier being carried through the indoors under the innkeeper's orders. No safe choice remained. There had not been one all morning. "I will not leave the records," she said. "Then bring them." He reached down, lifted the iron-bound chest as if it weighed no more than a saddlebag, and handed it to a groom with a look that fobbed her mishandling. She heard herself say, "Your Grace, the magistrate packet must be delivered in person." By whom? By me. He studied her again, this time as if fitting an unexpected instrument to an urgent task. Rain ran down his cheekbone and caught on the corner of his mouth. "You will deliver it after Blackthornne stands, or falls." That was not permission. It was an order shaped around necessity. She should have bristled. Instead, she felt a sharp, reluctant relief that someone in authority had finally named the scale of the danger without pretending gentility could bargain with floodwater. By the time they reached the mounting block, full morning had broken grey over the coaching yard, and every minute lost had become part of the river's advantage. A stable hand brought forward a bay mare with nervous eyes and a winter-thick neck. Margaret set her foot in the stirrup, pain flaring white at her split heel, and nearly slipped when wet leather turned under her sole. A gloved hand closed around her forearm, steady and hard. "Up," the Duke said. She mounted. Her shawl clung cold to her throat, the sealed packets pressed against her ribs. Behind them the footman stood in the rain with his valise and nothing else to command. The Duke swung into his own saddle and looked at her once, expression unreadable beneath the rain. "Do exactly as I say when we reach the embankment," he said. "No heroics." Margaret met his storm-grey stare and answered with quiet precision. "Then give correct orders, Your Grace." The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat she thought he would send her back to the yard in chains of protocol and contempt. Instead, he turned his horse toward the gate. "Ride!" They went out through the arch at a gallop, 4 riders and 1 woman in a mended gown with legal packets stitched against her ribs. Rain flattened the hedgerows and turned the road into dark paste that dragged at hooves. Margaret kept her seat by habit and pain. Her left heel burned where the seam had opened skin. Her fingers had gone numb around the reins. The account chest bounced against the flank of the groom's mount ahead, iron corners flashing dull when lightning moved behind clouds. No one spoke for the first mile. Wind stole breath too quickly for speech. Then the Duke angled his horse closer without looking at her. "Gauge marks again." She gave them between hoofbeats. "Willow Cut first, Stone Saint second. South Terrace line must open in sequence. If they break all at once, the surge will shear the lower lane." "You are certain?" "Yes." "Good." It was not praise, it was acceptance, plain as iron. By the time they crossed the second bridge, church bells were ringing faint through rain, and the river below ran high and brown, carrying branches, thatch, and 1 broken hen coop, spinning like a toy. Margaret looked once, and then forward again. Water at that speed did not negotiate. Blackthornne rose out of the weather like a fortress carved from wet slate. Long east wing, high central block, windows dark on the lower floors where servants had shuttered against the storm. The ornamental gardens terraced down from the south wall in careful geometry of stone, yew and rose, canes now bowed under rain. Beyond them, lower and less beautiful, the tenant village roofs huddled close beside the granary sheds and winter stores. One side of the estate had marble urns and clipped hedges. The other side had children's boots drying by hearths and sacks of seed measured to last until spring. The river did not care which was prettier. They entered the main yard at speed. Men were already hauling rope, timber, and sand sacks from wagons. Orders collided and tangled. Stuart, the river steward, in a soaked coat, ran toward the Duke with a sheaf of notes wrapped in oilcloth, speaking too quickly for clarity. 2 footmen hesitated under the portico, uncertain whether rank required them to stand dry or move mud. The Duke dismounted in one motion. "Map room, 10 minutes! Stuart, with me! You!" he said to Margaret. "Come!" No one offered her a hand as she slid from the mare. She did not need one. She landed badly, heels screaming, steadied herself against the saddle, and followed at once. The map room was long, windowed and cold despite 3 fires. Estate plans covered one wall, pinned in overlapping layers from decades of revisions. A carved table stood in the centre under hanging lamps. The newest survey stretched across it and held at the corners with brass weights. Rain drummed the panes. Water dripped from cuffs and hems onto polished boards as people filed in. The chief steward, 2 overseers, a gardener with clay up to his knees, the Duke's younger brother in a perfectly tied cravat that weather had not touched, and, moments later, the Dowager Duchess with her daughter and son beside her, all of them pale with alarm and dressed as if for receiving callers rather than flood command. Margaret stopped near the end of the table. No one gave her space. She took it anyway. The Dowager's gaze slid over her like a draught through a cracked door. "Alistair, who is this?" "Miss Anderson." The Dowager waited for the title or explanation that would restore proper distance. None came. Her mouth thinned. "We have professional men present." Margaret saw Stuart, the river steward, flinch without lifting his head. His boots were caked in bank mud to mid-calf. He looked like a man who had been awake all night and did not know whether he would be thanked or dismissed for it. The Duke planted both hands on the table. "Report," Stuart pointed to the eastern bend. "Crack began here at first light. We shored with sacks. It widened by 2 inches in an hour. If rain holds, pressure reaches failure by mid-afternoon." The younger brother spoke first. "Then reinforce the wall." "With what stone?" the gardener snapped before remembering rank. "Quarry Road is under water." The Dowager lifted a hand. "The lower terraces represent 30 years of cultivation. They are the pride of this house. There must be another option." Margaret heard her own voice enter the room before she had permission. "There is. Lose the village." Silence struck hard. The daughter made a small sound of outrage. The younger brother stared as if she had slapped him. The Dowager turned fully toward her now. "You will remember where you are." Margaret met her eyes. "I remember exactly. Your granary and tenant stores sit on the flood path if the inner gate is cut." "South Terrace breach spares them," the younger brother scoffed. "On whose authority?" The Duke answered without turning. "Mine." It did not end argument. It ended performance. Men bent over the map. Stuart tapped marker points with a shaking finger. Margaret moved to the opposite side and corrected one line where the copied contour had reversed. She felt scrutiny like heat between her shoulder blades, the weight of a family unused to seeing decisions pass through a woman in a wet servant's dress. She did not look up. "Cut sequence," the Duke said. She traced it with the butt of a pencil. First incision here along the outer rose wall. Narrow channel, controlled depth. Then open this lower section when pressure drops 1 foot at willow gauge. Delay second cut by 12 minutes or you undercut your own labour. Stuart blinked at her, then at the Duke. 12? 12, she repeated. Not 10, not 15. The Duke nodded once. Done. The Dowager stepped closer, silk whispering over boards. "Alistair, you cannot be serious. You would destroy your father's terraces on the instruction of the only person in this room who caught the survey reversal in time," he said. The words fell blunt and final. No one answered them. He began issuing assignments in clipped lines. Stewart, embankment crews and gauges. Ridley, draft teams to south wall. Matthew, move household silver and records from lower cellars now, not later. Mother, take Eleanor and Henry to the West Hall and keep that corridor clear for medical cots. The dowager drew herself upright. I do not take directives in my own house. He looked at her then, face carved hard by rain and urgency. Today you do. The storm swallowed whatever reply she might have made, because at that moment a bell began clanging in the yard, sharp and fast, and a servant burst through the door with water to his thighs and terror in his voice. The east sacks have slipped. Sir, the line is moving. Everyone moved at once. Margaret took the outer stair 2 at a time and nearly fell when her bad heel struck stone. She caught the rail and kept going. In the yard, men ran bent under rope coils. A wagon axle snapped beside the well with a crack like musket fire. One of the draught horses reared, eyes white, and a groom went down in the mud under flailing harness. She ran to him. The horse was checked by 3 men pulling hard on the lead, but the groom's arm had twisted under the wheel. He bit down on a cry and tried to stand too soon. Margaret knelt in muck, felt a long bone and joint with quick fingers, and found no break, only strain and swelling. "Do not move it yet," she said. She looked up at the nearest man. "Splint board, cloth." "There is no time," someone shouted. "There is no spare arm if he tears it worse." She stripped the linen tie from her own cuff, wrapped the groom's forearm tight against a short plank, and secured it with 2 knots. "Now he can hold reins one-handed. Take him to lower team." The groom stared at her, rain and gratitude and pain all over his face. "Miss, go." She was already up and moving toward the south terraces. At the garden wall, labour had begun with shovels and picks where stone could not be blasted. The rose beds were a dark ruin of thorns and sodden petals. Men hesitated at the first strike against carved coping, the old reflex to preserve what was beautiful and expensive. Margaret took a mattock from a stunned gardener and drove it herself into the mortar seam. Impact jarred her shoulders. She struck again. White mortar split, stone shifted. "Open it!" she shouted over the rain. "This wall or the village. Choose." They chose. An hour into the work, water found the cut and surged through with a force that shoved 2 men backward. Margaret grabbed one by the coat and braced her boots against the edge until others caught him. Mud climbed past her ankles. Cold bit through soaked stockings like teeth. She did not step away. "Not yet," she called, when a foreman reached for the second charge. "Watch the willow mark. Wait." He cursed, pacing, glancing toward the distant embankment where men looked like black pins in rain. "If we wait and lose it..." "If you open now, you scour the channel and lose both lines. Wait!" He obeyed because she said it as if disobedience were arithmetic error, not insubordination. She could not see the Duke. She assumed he was at the east line. By the time the west clock struck 1, the first gauge runner came slipping through mud with water up to his calves. "Drop of 1 foot at Willow." "Now," Margaret said. The second cut went in. Stone gave. Water roared through the new channel and spread across the sacrifice terraces, tearing out rose roots, statues, and years of careful pride, then turning away from the lower village, exactly as her father's old notebook said it would if given room. Men who had doubted her shouted in raw relief and kept shoveling. She stumbled once when her heels slid on algae-slick stone. A hand caught her elbow, gloved, unyielding. She turned, breath hard, and found the Duke beside her, coat drenched to black, mud to his knees. "You stayed at the east line?" she said, surprised by how thin her voice sounded. "It is holding." His eyes moved over her face, her soaked sleeves, the blood washed pale at her cuff from split knuckles she had not noticed opening. "You are shaking. Everyone is shaking." He ignored the deflection. "When did you last eat?" She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question in that rain with a river-breaking stone around them. "At the inn, at Bread End." His mouth went flat. He signalled a footman on the path. "Broth, dry blanket. Here." The footman blinked, looked at Margaret as if uncertain he had heard correctly, then ran. Margaret turned back to the channel. "If the East Line fails in the next hour, this may still—" "Stop," he said. The word cut through storm noise and through her at once. She faced him. His voice dropped, quieter, more dangerous for its control. "You will not fall where you stand and call it duty. Sit for 5 minutes, then work." It was command-shaped as care, and she hated that her body answered before pride did. Her knees softened. Cold tremors she had held at bay began in earnest. He took off his greatcoat and put it around her shoulders without ceremony. It was heavy, wet outside, warm inside where it had held his heat. She gripped the collar once to steady her hands and sat on an overturned stone trough while men moved past with picks and rope. From that lower vantage the world narrowed to mud, boots, water and breath. The footman returned with a tin cup of thin broth and a hunk of bread. She drank too fast, coughed, drank again. Salt and warmth hit her blood like mercy. No one from the family approached her there. They watched from the upper path where umbrellas failed in the wind. The Duke did not remain beside her. He moved between crews, speaking little, redirecting teams, sending riders, returning twice to the terrace edge to check gauge runners, and once to stand very still behind her, while she recalculated run-off times on a scrap of soaked paper. He did not interrupt. She realized only when she looked up that he had been reading over her shoulder for several minutes, silent as stone. "You wrote parallel ledgers," he said. It was not a question. She folded the scrap once. "Yes." "Where are they?" "Not in Lady Anderson's house." "Good." That single word carried more approval than any comfort she had been offered in years. A crash sounded from the far side where a decorative balustrade gave way into the flood channel. Men shouted. Margaret rose again, coat slipping from one shoulder, and moved to the breach edge to redirect spade teams toward the new erosion line. She did not feel the rain now, only the rhythm of tasks and intervals, watchmark, signal, cut, brace, clear. The estate's survival became a sequence of decisions measured in feet and minutes, and she held that sequence like a pulse. Late in the afternoon, when the rain finally eased from hammering sheets to steady fall, the third runner came from the east bank, with mud to his chest and disbelief in his eyes. "Pressure is dropping! East line holding! Village lane clear!" The nearest men stopped, as if they had forgotten how to stand without leaning into force. Then noise rose, ragged and human, not triumph, not yet, but the sound of people who had not drowned that day. Margaret closed her eyes once, opened them, counted again. "Maintain through dusk," she said. "Do not trust a river after one kindness." They obeyed. She turned to find the Duke on the path above, rain on his face, hands bare now, watching her with an unreadable stillness that felt less like scrutiny than recognition. He stepped down into the mud and came close enough that only she could hear him. "You saved them first," he said. "You did not even look at the house." Margaret thought of Rose terraces collapsing, of granary doors still dry, of tenant names she had copied for years while being told she was useful only as ink and silence. Her throat tightened around exhaustion and anger and a strange, unwelcome relief. The house can rebuild stone, she said. The village cannot rebuild winter. For a moment he did not move. Rain ticked off broken marble into the channel below. Behind them, Blackthorne's family stood on the higher walk, quiet at last, their beautiful garden torn open to keep their people alive. When he spoke, his tone returned to command, but the edge had altered. Then you will remain at my side until this is fully secured. She looked at him through wet lashes, coat heavy on her shoulders, hands split and filthy, body aching in every joint. On the embankment, she said, I remain where the numbers require. His mouth shifted, the smallest motion, not quite a smile, and not refusal either. Then stay where the numbers require, Miss Anderson, he said. I will be there. Margaret held his gaze for one suspended breath, then turned back to the channel, because the river still had work to demand from them. Men were resetting stakes where the second cut had widened. 2 teams hauled broken stone from the current with hooks and curses. The sacrifice terraces lay in torn levels of black earth and uprooted rose canes, petals pasted to mud like scraps of silk after a fire. The water had slowed, but not enough to trust. She moved along the edge, calling depths, correcting angles, sending one crew farther left where seep was beginning beneath a carved stair that no longer led to anything useful. He did not leave. Where she went, she heard his boots a few paces behind or beside her, steady through muck, through shouting, through the rattle of tools. He spoke to foremen in clipped lines. He took reports from riders and gave them back as orders stripped to essentials. Yet each time she glanced up, he was there, watching not the ruined terraces but her hands, her gait, the way she favoured the left foot only when she forgot to hide it. By the time the first lamps were lit under the south arcade, dusk had gone lead-grey and the rain had thinned to a cold mist that settled into cloth and bone. A runner splashed up from the east line and saluted with a shaking arm. "Pressure stable, Your Grace. Drop of another 3 inches. Hold rotation at 20-minute checks," the Duke said. "No one abandons post for supper. Food to the line." The runner nodded and turned. Margaret stepped toward him. "Tell them to watch the culvert mouth below the mill track. If debris catches there overnight, we lose the gain by morning." The runner looked between her and the Duke, uncertain where authority sat. The Duke answered for him. "You heard Miss Anderson." The man repeated the instruction word for word and ran. She should have felt vindication. Instead, she felt the tremor in her calves sharpen into weakness. The broth had held for an hour. Then work had burned through it. Her teeth struck once against each other. She clamped her jaw. The Duke heard the click anyway. "Enough," he said. She kept her eyes on the water. "Not yet. Now." She straightened, anger flaring because anger was warmer than exhaustion. "If the night turn comes early and no one tracks the south wash, I am tracking it." His voice was low, controlled, final. She turned then, coat slipping from one shoulder, hair wet against her throat, hands raw and dark with mud and blood that was no longer fresh enough to sting. "You cannot stand on every line at once, Your Grace." "No, but I can keep one person from collapsing in front of 200 men because she mistakes endurance for strategy." The words struck with the same blunt force as his orders in the yard. She opened her mouth to answer and found none that did not sound like pride pretending to be duty. He looked at her split knuckles, then at the cuff where dried red had stiffened linen. "You will come inside," she set her jaw. "I am not a guest." "Correct." His eyes held hers, storm grey and unblinking. "You are the reason my tenant's stores are dry. Move." The command carried over the nearest crews. Men looked away quickly, as if caught witnessing something private that had happened in public. Margaret walked. He did not touch her arm this time. He did not need to. He matched her pace as they crossed the broken terrace path and climbed toward the south doors, where servants waited with lanterns and uncertain faces. Inside, heat struck her skin with a pain almost as sharp as cold. The passage smelled of wet wool, lamp oil, and boiled barley from the kitchens below. Mud marked every stone where work crews had passed. A maid stared at Margaret's dress, then at the Duke's coat on Margaret's shoulders, and dropped into a curtsy so abrupt she nearly lost her tray. They entered the West Hall, where the family had gathered under chandeliers lit too early, as if light could restore order by decree. The dowager stood near the hearth in dry silk, the colour of old ivory. Eleanor Vale sat rigid on a chaise with a blanket over her lap and a handkerchief crushed in one fist. Henry Vale paced beside the mantel, boots clean, expression brittle with contained outrage at the state of his mother's gardens, and perhaps at being powerless to prevent it. Conversation stopped when they saw Margaret. The dowager's gaze travelled from Margaret's mud-streaked hem to the blood at her wrist, then to Alistair. "She cannot remain here in this condition." Margaret felt old humiliation rise on reflex, that familiar narrowing where she became an object to be moved, corrected, hidden. She pulled the coat closer and prepared to step back into the corridor before she was told. Alistair did not give her room to retreat. "She remains where I place her," he said. His mother drew herself taller. "Alistair!" He did not raise his voice. "Her hands are split. She has not eaten enough to stand. She saved your village, your granary, and your labourers, while this room argued over roses." Silence fell so hard that even the fire sounded loud. Eleanor looked down first. Henry's mouth opened, then closed. The dowager's face did not soften, but some rigid certainty in it shifted by a fraction, as if a line long defended had been crossed and could not be redrawn. Margaret stood very still. No one had named her suffering aloud in front of rank before. Not once in 7 years. Her throat tightened around a response she would not let become tears. The Duke turned to the butler at the door. "Hot water, clean bandages, send for Dr. Hale and Mrs. Davies. Food now, not tea and biscuits. Food." "Yes, Your Grace." He turned again, this time to Margaret. "Map room." The room moved aside for her as if she had acquired title between one breath and the next. She walked through the gap without lowering her head. In the map room the fires had been built high. Damp plans curled at the edges on the walls. The central table was crowded with weights, ink pots, and 2 fresh survey sheets weighted by a carving knife and a brass compass. Rain tapped the windows in thin, persistent fingers. Margaret reached for the nearest chair and misjudged the distance. Her knee struck wood. The world tilted once. A hand caught the back of the chair before it could slide. "Sit," he said. She sat. Mrs. Davies arrived first, grey-haired, brisk, apron already tied over a dark dress, as if she had expected to be called eventually, and only waited for permission. She took one look at Margaret's hands, and made a low sound in her throat that held no surprise and no pity, only practical anger on behalf of injured skin. "Hold still, miss." A basin was set down. Steam rose. The first touch of warm water on split knuckles burned so fiercely, Margaret sucked in breath through her teeth. Across the table, Alistair remained standing. Dr. Hale entered with his case, bowed to the Duke, then came to Margaret. He examined her hands, her heel, the shiver in her shoulders. "Exhaustion and exposure," he said. "Minor lacerations. No break in the foot. She requires rest and heat." "Do what is needed," the Duke said. As the doctor cleaned and wrapped, Margaret answered questions without drama. Yes, she could flex the fingers. Yes, the heel had bled since morning. No, she had not been dizzy until the last hour. She did not mention the hunger headaches of the last month because that was old weather and irrelevant to immediate function. A tray arrived, thick vegetable stew, coarse bread, cheese, and a cup of watered ale. Mrs. Davies set it within reach and fixed Margaret with a look that brooked no refusal. "Eat while he raps, miss." Margaret took the spoon in her left hand, because the right was being bandaged, and managed 3 mouthfuls before her stomach cramped in protest at sudden abundance. She slowed, kept going. Throughout it all, Alistair stood at the far corner of the table, one hand on the map weights, receiving reports from soaked messengers who came in, spoke, and left. He did not sit. He did not remove his boots. He did not move farther than a few steps from where she sat, even when Henry appeared at the door and murmured that the engineer from North Cut had arrived. Alistair answered without turning his head. "Bring him here." Henry hesitated. "In this room." "In this room?" When Henry left, Margaret looked up despite herself. "You need not remain for this." His gaze shifted from the reports to her face. "I do." The words were simple. They landed like something heavier. Dr. Hale finished the final wrap at her right palm and turned to the heel, cutting away the soaked stocking seam with careful scissors. Margaret stared at the map instead of watching. Embarrassment rose hot under her skin. Not for the injury, for being tended in the Duke's map room like a person whose body mattered. He spoke as if reading the direction of her thoughts. "No one in this house will call this weakness." She swallowed a bite of bread and said, quieter than intended, "No one in my other house called it anything. They preferred not to see." His jaw set. "I see it." Mrs. Davies glanced once between them, then bent to tie the final knot at Margaret's ankle with deliberate gentleness. When the doctor stepped back, Alistair moved forward and laid a folded paper beside Margaret's plate. Fresh ink, heavy seal. She looked at it, then at him. "Read." She wiped her fingers and unfolded it. Temporary flood authority, written in his hand and countersigned with his signet. Any foreman, steward or labour captain on Blackthornne grounds was to obey Miss Margaret Anderson's engineering directives regarding embankment, drainage and storehouse protection until formal revocation by the Duke himself. Her pulse kicked once against her throat. "This will provoke your family." "It already has. You can withdraw it tomorrow and call this necessity." "I will not." She held his gaze, searching for mockery, calculation, any trace of a test disguised as trust. She found only fatigue, control, and something else beneath both that looked dangerously like resolve. "Why?" she asked. He was silent long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then, very evenly, "Because I buried a brother after men ignored warnings they found inconvenient. I will not repeat that history to protect anyone's pride. Not mine, not theirs." The confession sat between them, stripped of ornament, impossible to mishear, and impossible to return once spoken. She lowered her eyes to the paper, to the dark impression of his crest beside her name. The room seemed smaller, closer, held in the circle of lamplight and rain. A messenger entered with mud to his collar and saluted. "Your Grace, East Watch requests night allocation orders." Alistair did not look away from Margaret when he answered. "Miss Anderson will dictate them. You will copy precisely." The messenger blinked. "Sir." "Precisely." Margaret set down the paper and rose carefully, testing the bandaged heel. Pain answered, sharp, but manageable. She stepped to the map table. Alistair shifted one map weight so she could flatten the sheet, then moved half a pace back and stayed there, close enough that she felt the heat from his sleeve, far enough not to crowd. She dictated rotations, culvert checks, lantern intervals, and food runs. The messenger wrote quickly, repeated each line, and corrected one number when she caught his slip. Alistair listened without interruption. When she finished, he sealed the order and handed it to the man. "Go." The door closed. For the first time since the yard, the room was quiet. Margaret gathered the edges of the Flood Authority paper and folded it once, exactly on the crease. "I still must deliver the magistrate packet in person," she said. "If Lady Anderson reaches that office first, she will claim coercion." "At dawn," he said. "With escort." "With witness from the inn office, if possible." "I have already sent for him." She looked up sharply. "When?" "While you were on the terrace calculating run-off times." A pause. "I have been watching, Miss Anderson." Not as threat, not as ownership, as fact. The fire snapped. Rain whispered at the glass. Down in the yard, a bell marked the change of watch. He reached for the coat still around her shoulders, straightened the collar where it had twisted, then let his hand fall away at once, as if aware of the line and choosing not to cross it. "You will sleep in the East Steward's chamber," he said. "It is near the map room and dry. Mrs. Davies will bring fresh linen and food again in an hour. You will eat it." She almost argued from habit. Then she looked at the bandages on her hands, the signed authority beside her plate, and the man who had stood through the entire dressing as if motion itself might break something newly and unwillingly admitted. "Very well, Your Grace," she said. His eyes held hers one moment more, winter grey and steady. "Good," he said. "At first light we finish this properly." At first light Margaret woke in the East Steward's chamber to the ache of bandaged hands and the unfamiliar weight of having slept in dry linen while rain still tapped the panes. For one disoriented moment she reached for the account chest and felt only the coarse blanket. Then memory returned in full sequence. The breached terraces, the signed Flood Authority, the Duke's coat, the order to finish this properly. She rose before Mrs. Davies knocked, dressed in a plain wool gown borrowed from the housekeeper's stores, and pinned her dark hair with a fresh comb that did not bite her scalp. When she stepped into the corridor, Alistair Vale was already there, gloved, silent, and waiting beside the map room door. Inside, the older inn clerk stood by the table with his hat in both hands, damp at the brim from morning mist. Beside him was a magistrate's deputy in travelling black, ink case strapped at his belt. Stewart had spread the ledgers in 3 lines, Blackthornne accounts, Anderson copies, and the emergency rolls Margaret had carried against her ribs through rain. The locked chest sat at the table's end. Its old brass scar near the keyhole gleamed in firelight. "You came," Margaret said to the clerk. He gave a small bow. "You requested witness in person, Miss Anderson. I am here to repeat what I sealed." The deputy produced a paper. "By district notice filed yesterday, we open immediate review under flood exigency statute. All related custodians are to present original instruments." Alistair looked to Margaret. "Begin!" She set her hand on the chest, then on the fold line where the wood panel inside could be lifted if one knew where to press. Her father had shown her when she was 14, saying that every honest steward needed one place for papers too dangerous for display. The panel shifted. She withdrew 2 oilskin-wrapped notebooks, their covers worn, Eric Anderson's initials burned into the leather. The room went still. Stewart leaned in despite himself. "Survey field books," Margaret nodded. "Original gauge runs. East line before and after the mirrored copy." The deputy opened the first notebook and compared the hand to signed receipts already on the table. "Consistent script, consistent pressure." He looked up. "These will be entered as primary evidence." By the second hour after sunrise, the rain had stopped, and weak November light lay over the torn south gardens while names were called into the West Hall. The Dowager came first, composed and pale. Henry and Eleanor followed. Stuart stood near the map stand with mud still dried at his cuff. The footman from Anderson House arrived under summons and looked smaller without a valise to shield him. Last came Lady Anderson in lavender silk, chin lifted, Amelia and Jane on either side in travelling cloaks trimmed with fur, as if they had mistaken a hearing for a call. She looked once at Margaret's bandaged hands and smiled without warmth. "I see Blackthornne has promoted dramatics," she said. The magistrate himself had ridden in before noon, boots wet, temper dry. He took his place at the long table, accepted the deputy's packet, and began without flourish. Charges were read in plain language: falsified repair disbursements, forged supervisory signatures, predatory refinancing against concealed risk, and intentional concealment of embankment error, likely to produce catastrophic loss and forced sale. Figures followed, each one precise. Stone loads billed and undelivered. Timber invoices duplicated. Labour tallies inflated by names of men long dead or moved away. Fraud total £6,412 across 3 years and 2 quarters. Lady Anderson laughed once, sharp and brittle. "This is absurd! On whose testimony? Hers?" "On records," the magistrate said, and lifted Margaret's father's notebook. "On seal witness, from the coaching office. On comparative pen analysis. On steward corroboration. On your own household signature books." She turned on Margaret, voice rising. "You ungrateful girl! After I fed you, clothed you." "You withheld both when it suited you," Margaret said quietly. Gasps rustled through the servants at the back wall. The Dowager closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing against a truth she had declined to inspect. Lady Anderson moved then, fast enough to startle her daughters, hand lifted toward Margaret's face in the same public gesture she had used before when humiliation required an audience. Alistair crossed the distance in one stride and caught her wrist in the air. "Do not touch her," he said. No one spoke. He released Lady Anderson only when the guard captain stepped forward. The magistrate did not raise his voice. "Lady Anderson, you are removed from all management authority pending trial. You will surrender keys, seals, and household account instruments now." For the first time since entering, real fear broke through her polish. She looked to Amelia, to Jane, to the Dowager, seeking intervention by rank or sympathy. None came. The Dowager's face remained grave and still. Henry looked down at the fraud column as if seeing numbers for the first time as consequences rather than abstractions. The keys were produced. The private seal ring followed after a pause long enough to mark resistance. The guard captain took both and nodded to 2 officers at the door. Amelia began to cry. Jane whispered, "Mother, say something." Lady Anderson said nothing. She was escorted out beneath the same high plaster ceiling where she had once entered like weather and command, lavender scent trailing behind her, into the corridor until even that faded. When the doors closed, the hall held a silence too heavy to leave unmarked. The magistrate dipped his pen and signed seizure orders. The deputy sealed evidence packets. The inn clerk countersigned. The footman from Anderson House, pressed for statement, admitted under oath that the chest key had been withheld by Lady Anderson before the coaching yard errand. His voice shook. He did not look at Margaret. 3 days passed before the district office returned, confirmed filing numbers, and the first injunction copy, with red ribbon and court wax. On the 4th morning, tenants were called to the granary court, where sacks stood dry in ordered rows, and the winter stores smelled of barley, burlap, and smoke. The flood line had been stabilised with temporary stone and timber. The south terraces remained broken, black earth raked flat where roses had been. Alistair stood on the loading step in a plain dark coat, no ceremonial sash, no attempt to soften the workman's setting into society theatre. Margaret stood at his right in steward grey, father's compass polished and hanging from her belt. He had found it in an Anderson cabinet after the seizure list and returned it without speech the night before. Stewart read the revised contracts aloud, rent adjustments for flood-loss strips, repair labour paid at posted rates, seed allocations protected from emergency seizure, drainage oversight assigned to the estate steward with mandatory dual sign-off on all embankment expenditures. At that line, murmurs moved through the crowd. Alistair lifted a hand. Blackthornne's new estate steward is Miss Margaret Anderson. Her authority over river works and tenant accounts is formal and permanent, unless revoked by signed cause in open council. He stepped back. Margaret looked over faces she had known on paper for years and in person too seldom because class lines were fences even in crisis. Old Turner from Willow Row, cap in both hands. Mrs. Bell with flour still on her sleeves from dawn baking. The miller's sons, mud to their knees. She read the clauses again in clear voice, slower, and invited objections line by line. There were questions. She answered each with numbers, maps, and dates. Nothing was concealed behind courtesy. By the end, men and women came forward in turn to mark or sign their names. The first signature was Old Turner's shaking cross. The second was Mrs. Bell's full name in careful script. No one left without a copy. Near noon, as the last paper dried, the dowager approached Margaret in the open court. Silk still rustled at her hem, but her posture had changed from command to something harder and cleaner. "I did not ask what I should have asked," she said. "I saw what was convenient to see. That failure was mine." Margaret held her gaze. "It cost people dearly." "Yes." The dowager inclined her head, precise and public. "And you prevented the cost from becoming ruin." "Blackthornne is in your debt, Miss Anderson." Henry followed with a stiff bow and offered the formal acknowledgement he should have made at the map table. Eleanor, eyes rimmed red but steady, thanked Margaret for directing cots and broth to the east line and for keeping her child safe when timber fell in the storm. The child, arm splintered and smiling shyly from beside Mrs. Davies, held up a ribbon-wrapped posy of late hothouse violets. Margaret accepted it with bandaged fingers and a throat too tight for immediate reply. By the second week of December, the replacement embankment plan had been approved by the magistrate, funded under supervised disbursement, and posted in both village and Great Hall. That evening, after the last steward meeting, Margaret returned to the map room to place her father's notebooks in the new iron safe built into the inner wall. She logged each item in the evidence register. Original survey books, mirrored copy, corrected map, sealed court filings, and the flood authority paper signed on the storm night. Nothing left unaccounted, nothing left to memory alone. When she turned, Alistair stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, as if he had paused there longer than he intended. "The house is quiet," he said, "for once." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, not with secrecy, with intention. Firelight moved over his face, catching the old scar at his jaw she had noticed only in profile before. "Stay," he said. She did not rescue him from the weight of the word. "In what capacity?" His answer came without ornament. "As steward, because Blackthornne requires your mind. As my wife, because I require your equal." The room seemed to narrow to lamplight, paper, and breath. Margaret set the safe key on the table between them. "On equal terms," she said. "Separate signature authority. Tenant protections cannot be withdrawn without open counsel. No silence where numbers warn otherwise. Ever." His mouth shifted. That near smile she had learned to read as certainty, not ease. Agreed. He took the key, then placed it back in her palm and closed her fingers over it. Outside, winter wind moved through the repaired yard, and inside Blackthornne's map room, the last unsigned page found its witness.